Kedushat Kodesh Ha-Kodashim is the last chapter in Rabbi Aharon's Sefer on Kedushat, on Kedushat Aviv. And in many respects, the Kodesh Ha-Kodashim is the high point of holiness, certainly in the separation that Rabbi Lichtenstein makes within the Sefer between Kedushat HaMakom and Kedushat HaZman, that the ultimate level of Kedushat HaMakom is the Kodesh Ha-Kodashim. And in this regard, Rabbi Lichtenstein brings us into this place through the halacha, because this is basically a sefer halacha. It is a book of lamdus, really focusing on the halachic considerations that allow us to understand the nature of kedusha. And in this situation, Rabbi Lichtenstein looks at the primary halacha of the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is the isur of entering into the Kodesh HaKodashim, whether a person is a Kohen or a Kohen Gadol or Stam a Jew. To be able to enter into the Kodesh HaKodashim at any time other than on Yom HaKippur with the Seder HaVodah is something which causes a person to receive the Chiyuv Misa of Misa B'dei Shamayim. Rabbi Lichtenstein notes an opinion from Beit HaBrisk about the specific application of this Chiyuv Misa, perhaps only to the Kohanim who are part of the Ma'arechet HaAvodah. But Rabbi Lichtenstein goes on to suggest that there is something about this Chiyuv Misa which is different from all other Chiyuve Misa B'dei Shamayim, such that it's not listed among them. And that is that Rabbi Lichtenstein suggests that here the Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim is not a function of any result of the action of the person who violates a prohibition, but rather is a result of the very entering into this place, that the place itself causes death on an almost natural level. He quotes from the Midrash, which describes how, that Rashi quotes, on Parshas Achremos, that Rabbi Yahya, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Mashlo Mashal. But there's almost a metaphor to this point. Lamad avar doma. What is the isur of entering into the Kodesh HaKodashim? L'cholesh nichnas etzel harofei. It's like a sick person who goes to a doctor. Omer lo, al tishet sonein ve'al tishkav betachav. The doctor gives all sorts of instructions to the sick person. Do this, don't do that. Ba achar v'amar lo. Another doctor comes and says to him, Al tishtet sonim v'al tishkav betachav. Shelo tamut kederech shemeis ploni. You should not die the way this person died. And that, according to the metaphor, is what happened to the instruction of the pasuk, Acharei mos shnei bnei Aharon, b'karvasam el Kodesh. It was that they entered in that moment, and it was that act that we are using to learn this isur from. But not just an isur, that it's almost like a natural reaction, the same way that a chola is not instructed with some sort of tzivoy or command. Don't do these things because they're going to cause your illness to get worse. Rather, the very nature of the thing causes that. And on some level, that's what happens here when it comes to the entering into the Kodesh HaKodashim. Now, I'd like to take a step back in terms of our analysis of the isur of entering the Kodesh HaKodashim and the nature of the Kedusha, and just to reflect upon what's missing from this description of the Kodesh HaKodashim. And that is that we don't have here a positive description about what is the advantage, what is the beauty, what is the holy experience that the Kohen Gadol receives on this day. And here within this moment, we have a unification of the two types of Kedusha, which really are at the center of the book. That here we have the holiness of Yom Kippur with the holiness of the Kodesh HaKodashim, and perhaps also with the holiness of the Kohen Gadol, a part of the book which is not really covered, that of Kedushat HaAdam. And here we have the highest level of both of these Kedushot, and yet we have no reflection upon what is that experience, what is the ma'aleh, what is the beauty, what is the wonder that the Kohen Gadol experiences here within this moment. And the fact that Rav Lichtenstein does not give us that is because on a certain level, it's not because it's not there in the Gemaras either. It's not there in the Mishnayos. It's something that we have to, in some way, imagine what that inner life is of this highest level of holiness of the Kodesh Ha-Kodashim. And in fact, this is something that Rav Lichtenstein himself referenced through perhaps another mashal when he was interviewed by Rav Chaim Sabato in the book Mevakshe Panecha, where Rav Aharon was asked by Rav Sabato to describe his own emunah. And Rav Lichtenstein responded to that question by saying, you want me to talk about my faith in Hashem? Is that what you want? It's a person's Kodesh Ha-Kodashim. It is the holiest of holies. Lifnai v'lifnim shelo. It is utilizing the other term to refer to the Kodesh HaKodashim as lifnai lifnim. This is lifnai lifnim of a person. It is the utmost inner parts of that person. Ha'intimi shebe'intimiim. The most intimate of intimacies. And so Rav Lichtenstein in some way was pulling back and hiding, concealing even a little bit of his own inner world, his own emunah, through the metaphor of the Kodesh HaKodashim. I think it's worthwhile for us to take a moment to appreciate from where this metaphor emerges. Because if we both reflect upon the Isurim that Rav Aharon describes in this chapter, that this is a place where, almost by the very nature of the place, there was a deathly aspect to it. And this is something which is very counter our understanding of the holy. That we imagine that the holy is this beautiful, big rock canty mountain where everything is stupendous. That's the culture in which we live. But yet, the nature of Kedushat is davka one of great fear and great risk. That is the story that Rav Aharon describes in Parshat Mishpatim, of those people who saw, and the pasuk is to tell us that they were not subject to death, despite the fact that they came and saw Hashem on whatever level that means. And Rav Aharon quotes the various Meforshim into the interpretation of that incident. But Rav Aharon emphasizes the point that really a person who comes to that level of Kedusha, or that level of seeing the divine, there is somehow a need that they somehow die. That's what is required of it, that there's certain risk involved in the pursuit of the holy. Now for us, this is something very strange, but that is a piece of what Rav Aharon describes here. Now, earlier in the Sefer, Rav Aharon has a distinction between the nature of what the Beit HaMikdash is. And he describes how there is, on the one hand, the Mizbeach, which is the place where we, as the Jewish people, create Kedusha by offering korbanot. And then there's another side of the Beit HaMikdash, which is the place of the Shekhinah, where Kadosh Baruch Hu comes from above and becomes present with us through the Mikdash. And it's almost as if there's two poles within the very structure of Kedushat HaMakom. On the one hand, we generate Kedusha, and on the other hand, Kadosh Baruch Hu brings Kedusha from above. And this is a theme within the Sefer as a whole that does not just apply to Kedushat HaMakom, but also applies to Kedushat HaZman as well. The Rav Lichtenstein distinguishes at the very beginning of the Sefer between the Kedusha of Shabbat, which somehow comes from above, and then the Kedusha of Yom Tov, which comes from below. That we create the Kedusha of Yom Tov by our fulfilling the mitzvot and making this time a special time, we generate that Kedusha. And it's this chakira, this distinction between these two types of Kedusha that is really at the essence of Rav Aharon's approach to the ability of human beings to be a party, to be a part of that Kedusha. But within the Kodesh HaKodashim, there's no place for the human initiative in generating that Kedusha. This is the Lifnai Lifnim. This is the place of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's throne, the Aharon that existed in the times of the Beit HaMikdash Harishon, the first Beit HaMikdash. And in this place, there can be no human initiative. Everything must be exactly as the Kodesh Baruch Hu describes. We are not able to enter by our discretion, and if we do, there's a chovas misa b'dei shamayim, almost as if it was a natural result of the very presence of a human being in that place and being mechalel that place by that presence that was not needed. And that is only emphasized that much more in the second Beit HaMikdash, where the Kodesh HaKodashim is a place where there's no Aharon at all. The place is entirely empty. And that reality, that this is a place where we only have the makom that was once the place of the Aharon, is something which is only a further emphasis on this reality of Kedushat being something which is not able to be a place of human creation. It's a place almost of an emptiness where HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shechina can be present, and we are only able to enter when we are called upon. As Rav Aharon quotes from the Megillah, Asher lo yavo, asher lo kedas, that a person's not able to enter into this place without being specifically instructed by the Melech. That this is the lifnai v'lifnim of a Melech. And any person cannot enter that place, achat dato, that place is certainly going to be a place where that person will die, as what happened in the laws of Malchei Madayu Paras. Now, in answering that question that Rav Sabato posed, Rav Aharon begins with this concealment, when he uses this phrase of, this is my Kodesh HaKodashim, how dare you ask to enter into my Kodesh HaKodashim? But yet Rav Aharon does, in fact, answer that question. He does reply a bit in explaining what it was in that inner world. And he describes his own inner world with a beautiful set of descriptions, which I think further bring out the nature of the Kodesh HaKodashim and Rav Aharon's own approach, not in Kedushas Aviv, but rather in his shiurim on Zvachim. And Rav Aharon describes in the Sefer quoted by Rav Sabat, Mevakshei Panecha, he says about this experience of his own faith, he says, Ani chash kirva l'Kodesh Baruch Hu yoter mikol davar acher, that I feel a closeness to Hashem more than any other feeling. That to be a person who experiences Kedusha is to center that Kedusha above everything else that is. And I think that this is something which is appropriate for us as students of Lichtenstein, but really just as people who are trying to achieve all that we can as human beings here within this world, is to emphasize that Kedusha. And the centrality of this Sefer to Rav Aharon's own writing. This was a Sefer that he worked on for many, many years within his life. He wasn't able to complete it, but it was really a central component of his thought and of his philosophy, that human beings exist in relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu before everything else. And this has to be the primary avenue of how we see the religious life. That religion does not exist to make life better on some physical level, but rather the Kedusha is the goal. That all the physical things all exist for that relationship with Hashem. For us to follow in Rav Aharon's example and to be chash kirval kodesh brichu yoter mikol davar acher. And he goes on and says more. Ein davar sheni yoter batuach bo, yoter mishuchna, yoter chava, yoter margish me'asher ha'emunah. There's nothing that I feel more than faith. That faith is my essence. That is what we are more than anything else. And this is something to aspire towards, because it's not at all obvious. As much as we emphasize tefillah, as much as we emphasize Talmud Torah, but this feeling of emunah, of being so confident and feeling Hashem's presence with us in this way, is really the essential part of what it means to be a ben Torah, what it means to be a student of Avraham and a student of Aharon. And then he says more, B'sha'ah she'adam zakuk ad nimei nishmato lenochem o lechizuk. Tuchshat hatalut v'akesher ma'nika lo harbe yoter me'asher yedi'ah. That this feeling of God's presence, this feeling of dependence, this connection, is something which is greater than any other form of knowledge. There's something of this experience of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, this emunah, which goes beyond anything cognitive, anything intellectual. And I think that this is something that we should also be trying to build an certain interiority that Rav Aharon describes of his own emunah, when he is willing to let us in a little bit into his Kodesh Ha-Kodashim, to be able to recognize that with all our study of the Lamdus, but the Lamdus creates something more, that the Talmud Torah brings a kesher with a Kadosh Baruch Hu, that is something that evokes in some small way what existed in the Kedushat HaMakom and the Kedushat HaZman of the Kohen Gadol on that Yom Kippur day. And I'd like to tie this into one of Rav Aharon's approaches to the nature of the Beit HaMikdash. And he describes that there is within the very avodah a certain she'ifah, that the very structure of the avodah has within it a certain system, that you would slaughter and then you would bring elements of a korban at a certain location within the Beit HaMikdash. But there's always an element of the Hakrava which goes beyond, where there's a certain reach which goes beyond the primary location of a korban, such that the bringing of the chatat on Yom Kippur, even though it was brought primarily on the Mizbeach, there still is something which is sho'ef towards the Heichal and needs to go into the Kodesh HaKodashim. And Rav Aharon describes that this is something that does not just exist for the chatas on that day, but likewise the shlamim, which are krivim ba'azara, that also requires something more, that it also then is sho'ef for, it is shayach lehechal. And this she'ifah for more is something that, even though it has to be measured, it always requires all those limits. But where there is a possibility for a tzorech that would allow us to go to the Kodesh HaKodashim, we must. And that she'ifah is something which is a critical component of that religious life. And so I share these ideas in some respects at a certain frustration, because contained with Kedushat Aviv is a certain humility. Rav Aharon, even when he gives us a window into Kedusha, it's something which very much understands the limitations that are a critical component of what makes Kedusha Kedusha. That Kedusha is a place of risk, of danger, but it's also a place of human aspiration towards that emunah that Rav Aharon centers as being the critical piece of what it means to be a human being. That for us, it's not enough just to live, but we have to have a Kodesh Baruch Hu in our lives. And it's that she'ifah of the Kodesh that exists in our aspiring towards making Shabbat more through not just experiencing the Shechina of Shabbat, but also creating that ot, creating that brit through our lives, creating a higher level to Shabbat, which goes beyond the essence of Shabbat as a chefza, but we bring our own personalities, our own efforts to be able to generate something more within Shabbat. That's likewise something which is true within the Mikdash too. And that is something that is highly scripted, extremely dangerous, and at the very same time something which is essential and core to who we are as human beings. And so as we close our study of Kedushat Aviv, and we appreciate the tremendous lessons of Kedusha and the lamdus that is the basis for all of this experience of having in our day a kirva l'kodesh brichu, where we do not have a Beit HaMikdash, where we can perform these korbanot, but it's nishama parim sfatenu, that through our learning, and specifically through the learning of a sefer like that of Rav Lichtenstein, to be able to appreciate the Beit HaMikdash on a different level, on a deeper level, in a way that's able to bring something to our neshamot, is something of such great importance for us to be able to bring that Kedusha through our Talmud Torah, and may we be zocha through this learning to once again experience that Kedusha where it belongs, in the true Kodesh HaKodashim, in the Beit HaMikdash.